2022, Putin stood on television and told the world Ukraine doesn't exist. He was wrong. And history, 5,000 years of it, is about to prove him absolutely wrong. Before Moscow was even a village, Kyiv was already a metropolis. Let that sink in. 5,000 years ago, long before empires, long before kings, on a vast windswept grassland called the Pontic Steppe, humans first climbed onto the back of a horse. That single act changed warfare forever. This land, this brutal, beautiful highway between Europe and Asia, would become the heart of modern Ukraine. The Scythians ruled it first. Then the Goths came through. Then Attila's Huns tore across it like a wildfire. One people after another, each leaving their mark, each eventually swallowed by the steppe. But then came a quieter people, farmers, settlers, builders, the Slavs. They didn't conquer the steppe, they put down roots in it. According to legend, in 482 AD, a chieftain named Kyiv founded a settlement on the banks of the Dnieper River. That city still stands today. We call it Kyiv. You think Vikings only raided Britain? Mate, they built an entire empire in Eastern Europe, and nobody talks about it. In the East, the Vikings weren't called Vikings, they were called Varangians, or simply the Rus, an old Swedish word meaning men who row. They came down the great rivers, the Don, the Volga, the Dnieper, not to pillage churches, but to trade with Constantinople and Baghdad, the richest cities on earth. Along the way, they planted themselves over the Slavic tribes living on the riverbanks, not destroying them, ruling them. In 879, a chieftain named Rurik was reportedly actually invited by the Slavic tribes of the north to rule over them. He accepted. His successors pushed south. They seized Kyiv and built a medieval empire that would shake the world. They called it the Kyivan Rus. Under Volodymyr the Great, the old pagan gods were thrown out. Eastern Orthodox Christianity came in. A new identity was born. Under his son, Yaroslav the Wise, Kyiv became a city of 45,000 people, rivaling London, rivaling Paris. Grand cathedrals, golden gates, a written legal code. A metropolis, while Moscow was still a border village nobody had heard of. This was not Russia. This was not Belarus. This was Kyivan Rus, and its heart beat in Kyiv. Just when Ukraine was flourishing, the most terrifying army in human history turned up and burnt everything to the ground. November 1240. Batu Khan's Mongol army reached Kyiv, the mother of cities, reduced to ash and bone. But something survived. In the west, in the mountains and valleys of what is now western Ukraine, the kingdom of Ruthenia rose from the rubble. Its founder, King Danylo Romanovich, was a man who played every empire against each other just to keep his people alive. He bowed to the Mongol Khan. He negotiated with the Pope in Rome. In 1253, a papal crown was placed on his head. 300 years before a Tsar was crowned in Moscow, there was already a Ukrainian king. The people of this kingdom weren't called Ukrainians yet. They were called Ruthenians, a name that would stick for centuries. And slowly, quietly, their language began drifting away from the dialects of the north and east. Their church developed separately. Their culture grew its own roots. Ukraine was becoming Ukraine. Runaway serfs, defrocked priests, bankrupt nobles, together they became the most feared warriors in Eastern Europe, and they nearly built a free nation 400 years ago. By the 1500s, the lands of Ukraine were carved up between Poland and Lithuania. The Polish nobility owned everything. The peasants owned nothing. They were serfs, legally bound to the land, property, not people. But the steppe to the east, that was wild, ungoverned, dangerous, and for the desperate, it was freedom. Runaway serfs fled there, bankrupt nobles followed, defrocked priests, outlaws, misfits, all of them armed themselves and disappeared into the tall grass. They called themselves Cossacks, from a Turkic word meaning free man, and free they were. They elected their own leaders, hetmans. They voted on decisions in open councils, radas. In an age of absolute monarchies and feudal lords, the Cossacks had built something extraordinary, a functioning democracy on the wild Ukrainian frontier. Karl Marx himself once called it the first democratic Christian republic. They fought like nothing Europe had seen. Crack infantry, expert marksmen, lightning raiders on the Black Sea. They once sacked the Ottoman slave city of Kaffa and freed every single captive inside. The Poles didn't know whether to hire them or exterminate them, so they tried both. Neither worked. One man's stolen land, one escape from prison, the birth of a nation. A Cossack officer named Bogdan Khmelnytsky had his land stolen by a Polish nobleman. When he protested, they threw him in prison. He escaped. He went straight to the wildest, most dangerous Cossack fortress on the Dnieper, the Zaporozhian Sich, and he started a revolution. He allied with the Crimean Tatars, his traditional enemies, and smashed the Polish army twice. By December 1648, Khmelnytsky rode into Kyiv. The Orthodox metropolitan declared him a prince, declared his war a holy crusade. The runaway serfs and outlaws of the steppe had become nation builders. By 1649, the Cossack Hetmanate was born, a free Ukrainian state, democratic, orthodox, armed, and surrounded by enemies on every side. It would not last, but it would never be forgotten. In 1654, Ukraine made a deal with Russia for protection. The Russians broke every single promise they made, every single one. Khmelnytsky needed allies. The Ottomans were busy in the Mediterranean. Poland was the enemy. That left only one option. On 8 January 1654, the Cossack Hetmanate swore allegiance to Tsar Alexei of Russia, in exchange for military protection, in exchange for Cossack autonomy. The interpreters were needed at the meeting. Ukrainian and Russian were already different languages. These were not brothers reuniting. These were two distinct peoples making a deal, and Russia broke it almost immediately. Over the next century, Moscow stripped away Cossack rights, piece by piece, law by law. They conscripted Ukrainian men to die in Russian wars. They banned Ukrainian leaders from governing themselves. They planted Russian administrators into Ukrainian cities. Then came Peter the Great. Then came Catherine the Great. In 1767, the Cossack Hetmanate was abolished. In 1775, the Zaporozhian Sich was destroyed by Russian artillery. Ukraine was renamed Novorossiya, New Russia, as if the Ukrainians had never existed at all. He was loyal to Russia for 21 years. Then Russia asked him to burn his own homeland to the ground, and something in him finally snapped. Ivan Mazepa, scholar, diplomat, general, fluent in 7 languages, celebrated by Voltaire, romanticized by Lord Byron. For 21 years, he served Tsar Peter the Great faithfully, fought his wars, won his battles, received Russia's highest honor, the Order of St. Andrew. But in 1708, when Polish armies threatened the Hetmanate,
Mazepa sent urgent messages to St. Petersburg. Help us. We need protection. That's what we swore allegiance for. Peter's reply? Burn your own cities. Destroy your own homeland. Slow the enemy down. Mazepa stared at that order. At nearly 70 years old, after a lifetime of compromise, he finally said no. He rode out of his capital and joined the Swedish king, Charles XII. Peter's revenge was savage. His general massacred the city of Baturin, 10,000 men, women, and children slaughtered. At the Battle of Poltava in 1909, Mazepa's gamble failed. The Swedish army was crushed. Ukraine's last truly independent hetman died in exile shortly after. But not before saying, "Just as we freely bowed to the Tsar, so do we now, being a free people, freely depart." They banned the Ukrainian language, banned Ukrainian books. A government minister declared, "A separate Ukrainian language never existed, does not exist, and shall not exist." He was wrong as well.
Active, dramatic storytelling, emotional, and documentary. Under Russian imperial rule, the Ukrainian peasantry had serfdom reimposed on them. Free men made slaves again by the stroke of Catherine's pen. The universities built in Kyiv and Kharkiv, they weren't built to educate Ukrainians, they were built to Russify them, to teach them their history was a Russian history, that their language was just corrupted Russian, that their identity was a mistake. But something went wrong for the empire. The students and professors who were supposed to become instruments of assimilation became instruments of resistance instead. Mykola Kostomarov, historian, revolutionary, he declared the Ukrainians had always been a separate and distinct people, full stop. Taras Shevchenko, poet, serf's son, genius, born into slavery, bought his freedom by the artistic community of St. Petersburg, then wrote poetry in Ukrainian when all highbrow literature was expected to be in Russian. "Do not pay attention to the Russians," he wrote. "They are a people with a language, and so are we." In 1863, the Ukrainian language was banned from all official publications. In 1876, it was erased from public life entirely. Schools, theaters, concerts, all gone. And yet, the language survived. 27 million native speakers today. Say that to the imperial minister who declared it didn't exist. In 1932, Stalin knew people were starving to death in Ukraine. He knew, and he raised the food quotas anyway. After the Russian Revolution, Ukraine fought harder than almost any nation for its independence. A central Rada, a people's republic, an army. They were crushed by the Bolsheviks, absorbed into the Soviet Union in 1922. For a while, Lenin's policies allowed some cultural breathing room. Ukrainian schools, Ukrainian books, Ukrainian identity. Then Stalin came. Collectivization. Every farm, every grain, every animal, owned by the state. Ukrainian peasants slaughtered their own livestock rather than hand it over. The state called them enemies of the people. Over 2 million were deported to Siberia. 300,000 died on the way. Then the quotas came. Unachievable, deliberate, lethal. Activists went door to door, confiscating the last scraps of food from starving families. Grain was exported out of Ukraine, while Ukrainians died in the streets. The Red Army sealed the borders. Nobody could leave. Nobody could escape. At the peak of the famine, in June 1933, an estimated 28,000 people were dying every single day. The warehouses nearby, reportedly almost bursting with grain. By the end of 1933, somewhere between 1 million and 6 million Ukrainians were dead. The Ukrainians call it the Holodomor, murder by starvation.
Stalin then resettled Russian peasants onto the emptied Ukrainian land. Some argue about whether it was genocide, but the Soviet government's own newspaper wrote, in 1930, the destruction of Ukrainian nationalism was one of the main goals of collectivization. Make of that what you will. In 1991, after centuries of czars, emperors, and Soviet dictators, Ukraine finally declared independence. Russia never accepted it, and in 2022, they said so out loud.
By the 1980s, the Soviet Empire was cracking. Gorbachev's reforms opened the door, just a crack. It was enough. Ukrainian journalists started writing about the Holodomor, about the banned language, about the Cossack nation, about everything that had been buried under decades of Soviet concrete. Hundreds of thousands formed a human chain across Ukraine in January 1990, from Kyiv to Lviv, hand in hand, saying, "We are here, we exist, we remember." In August 1991, Ukraine declared independence. But freedom is never free. The economy collapsed, corruption hollowed the state out, oligarchs carved up everything. Russia never stopped interfering. In 2004, the Orange Revolution. In 2014, the Euromaidan. A president who tried to drag Ukraine back into Moscow's orbit was driven out by his own people. Putin's response? He sent troops into Crimea, launched a war in Donbass, and in February 2022 launched a full-scale invasion. Because some men cannot accept that a people have the right to exist. Putin stood on television in 2022 and declared Ukraine was not a real nation. A nation with roots older than Russia itself. A nation that survived Mongols, Tsars, Nazis, and Stalin. 5,000 years of history looked back at him and said, "We are still here."